Hello, everyone, and welcome. For most of you, hopefully this is a welcome back to the 2020 IABA Virtual Annual Meeting Plus. We've been absolutely thrilled with the level of participation and the engagement that we've seen in the sessions yesterday and the day before. And I have no doubt that we will continue to see that thought-provoking engagement in our session today. I am Kendra Lee Tang. I currently serve as co-chair of IABA's Volunteer Committee, and I'm also a consulting actuary based here in San Francisco, California, with Pinnacle Actuarial Resources. I'll serve as the moderator for today's session, where we'll cover George Floyd and beyond. What does real anti-racism look like in organizations, and how to lead through change? I just want to pause and say kudos to the planning committee, because this is such a great segue from the discussion we had last night. So for those who were unable to make it, yesterday we had an amazing panel of IABA leaders discussing racism in the actuarial profession. We started with a little bit of history of how we got to here, delve a little deeper into some of the discriminatory practices and procedures that we see in the insurance industry. And then I think really the meat of the discussion was individuals sharing their experiences and things that they've encountered in the career, and starting to move toward thinking through what solutions can we come up with. One of the quotes that was highlighted yesterday was one from Angela Davis, where she says, "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist." And I'd say that's right at the heart of the discussion that you will hear today from our speaker. Our speaker is an expert in this area, and I am excited to introduce her and kick off today's session. Before I do that, I would encourage you to use that Q&A function toward the bottom of your screen. Throughout the discussion, feel free to send questions along, because we will have a Q&A session at the end of the conversation with Valerie. And we have an amazing production team behind the scenes that will sift through those questions and make sure that they get addressed, as many of them as we can. So with that, I want to introduce Valerie to you all, who will be leading our discussion today. So Dr. Valerie Purdy Greenaway is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University and an instructor at Columbia Business School. She teaches, conducts research, and consults with global leaders to help them develop and foster diverse and inclusive work cultures. And I'd say Valerie takes it beyond just having a policy in place, really focusing on how do you have real and true diversity and inclusion, and that'll be some of the topic that we cover today. Her research focuses on how stereotypes about women, ethnic minorities, and other diverse groups undermines high performance. So again, I feel like we're gonna look at things through a lens that we typically don't look at it through. And it's really learning how to implement strategies that break through unconscious bias to maximize performance and motivation for all groups. As you can imagine, during this challenging time, there are plenty of demands on Valerie's time. She's currently developing workshops and thought papers to help workplaces amplify their purpose-driven inclusion and discuss race in the workplace. So we are thrilled to have Valerie with us. Again, feel free to throw questions in the Q&A box down below. And with that, I'll turn it over to Valerie to lead our discussion for today. And Valerie, you're muted right now.
Thank you so much. I am absolutely delighted to sort of be here with you. We are in some of the most challenging times, certainly in my lifetime and perhaps in many of yours. And yet for us to all come together and create and build and sustain these learning communities has really been just incredible. And as Kendra said, I spend a lot of my time in a laboratory conducting research on the science of inclusion, the causes and consequences of racism. How do we think about anti-racism? And my hope is to share a presentation with you all that will sort of highlight what is sort of going on in our times and how can we sort of link it to real change. When I was asked to be with you today, I sort of leaped at the opportunity, and the sort of planning committee was like, "Well, let me tell you a little bit about actuaries and what they do." And as it turns out, I actually know quite a bit because my husband, Black man, now a federal judge, when he was 18 years old in New York City, was the youngest Black, or the youngest individual selling life insurance to college students, literally going door to door in dorms. And so when I met him, I knew really nothing about actuarial science or even all that much about insurance. And I now know so much that I feel like I should have a T-shirt that says like "Cool kids have lots of insurance." So it just I am so I guess I would say honored to be here, because this is a world that folks of color need to be in more and more and more. And this moment in time, in terms of this pandemic, only illuminates more the power of what all of you do and what you can bring to the Black community. So for that, I say thank you before I begin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a presentation. It's about 40 minutes or so. I'm going to share some insights, some talking points that I hope will get us thinking about what real anti-racism looks like. And again, please populate the chat room with questions, and then we will field them at the end. So with that, I am going to share the screen and get rolling. So I would like to start off this presentation with a story. So this is a photograph of me in the New York Magazine a couple of years ago. I was had the honor of being one of the top 10 rated professors in New York City, and this was a feature article about me. And when you look at this picture and I'm smiling and I'm laughing, you would think that I was perhaps born to be a professor or born to do quantitative science. And this is just the natural sort of endpoint of my career. And what I would like to suggest is that it's actually quite the opposite. And so I wanted to share with you a story about what I think sort of demonstrates true anti-racism, even in a moment where that kind of language was not used. So early in my career, I started off as a professor at Yale University. And what's fascinating about Yale University is they say to you that you have 10 years to do the best scholarship that you can. They literally give you the key to your office and they say, good luck with that. There's very little mentoring structures whatsoever. On top of that, and what I now know and study, but at the time I didn't know, is that members of underrepresented groups, in particular, whether it's Black faculty members or whether you're in any other industry, we tend to not get really high quality feedback. We might get end of the year feedback in terms of how you're doing, but not sort of the day-to-day things that you need to really succeed. I had been in my job for 3 years. And in the sciences, you need to produce and publish papers. And I had lots of ideas, but I literally had no papers. And typically what happens is during that type of time frame, no one will say anything to you. And then, 3 or 4 years go by, and then you sort of just get asked to leave and go to a different university. That's not what happened to me. What happened to me is the chair of my department, she was an older white woman in an area of research that had nothing to do with mine, cognitive neuroscience and memory. She came to me and she said, I'm looking at your CV, you have lots of potential, but you haven't really published anything. And I said, yeah, well, I have lots of papers going. And she said, this is the profile of someone who's not gonna make it. And I'm gonna give you this piece of advice. You should always have something in the mail, meaning you should always have a paper that's about to be published. You should always have something that's about to be reviewed. And she said, if you follow that advice, you'll do fine. But she did more than just offer advice. She then asked me to be part of one of her grants, and she gave me what's called supplemental funding that she went after, that's specific for Black faculty, something that most people don't do because they say, oh, I don't want to be seen as racist. She sort of leaned in rather than lean out. She then started reading my papers. We developed a program of research together. And even though her area was not mine, she really took an interest in my scholarship. And in that moment, early on in my career, it literally changed the trajectory of what I was able to do. And what I'd like to say is that, there's lots of activity right now. People are reading White Fragility and books by James Baldwin, and they're sort of rediscovering all of this rhetoric around anti-racism. And yes, that's incredibly important. But what I really believe is important is in these moments when you can lean in, it's incredibly important to lean in, to be supportive, to push people along the way, to engage in equitable sponsorship, the things that are going to push us into positions of leadership, or if we're in positions of leadership, to amplify our voices for change for all of us. So what I want to sort of start with is I want to sort of think about the question of why now? What is going on in our society, or what has happened over the past 60 to 90 days that has led us to this moment where we're in incredible civil unrest and change? And I think it's incredibly important to always start with the pandemic, COVID-19. Why is that? Yes, we're working at home. Yes, it's sort of we're in this virtual landscape. But really any kind of global crisis of the magnitude that COVID-19 has is it exposes the machinery of our society. It exposes how our society actually works, who's driving the car, the power of the engine, who benefits and who suffers. That's what crises do. And it's within that moment that I think it's important to go back to before May 25th, before the George Floyd murder, to think about the language in which folks of color, African Americans, Latinx community, Native American community was being talked about in terms of the pandemic. Now, what I will say is there's probably not a person on the planet whose lives have not been touched. But there was a very particular set of language and reasoning that was being used that is unique and sort of steeped in racism. What is that? What we know, this is data that's now dated in June, that as of June, there were over 21,000 Black lives that were lost to COVID. There was sort of a disproportionate rate of death. And so this is sort of labeled a health disparity. But what people kept saying was, and they're still continuing to say it today, well, folks of color, we live unhealthy lifestyles, and that puts us in a higher risk category. So this at-risk category is almost thought of as a lifestyle choice based on the food that we eat or the places that we live. But what do we as scientists actually know? Well, what we know is, let's just take one example. One of the causes of death rates, and when you look at the chart at the bottom here, is chronic respiratory disease. 6.3% of deaths by COVID is due to chronic respiratory disease. What we also know is that African Americans, the Latinx community, is disproportionately likely to have chronic respiratory disease. But why is that? Well, what we know is that due to discriminatory mortgage lending practices, due to redlining, folks of color are more likely to live in places where there are higher rates of pollution, mainly near airports where there's lots of jet fuel and bus depots. What we also know is that that kind of pollution is linked to respiratory disease. So there's a straight linear line between discrimination and racism, disease, and COVID-19. But yet, oftentimes inequality is thought of as a lifestyle choice as opposed to rooted in institutions. This was before George Floyd. Then May 25th happened, and we have had the kind of civil unrest, not just in the United States, but over 60 countries around the world have been crying out that racism is no longer acceptable. But this is not just about whether we're going to continue to fund or defund the police. What also happened on May 25th, and for those of you who live in New York or just remember, was another incident that I would argue is equally as troublesome. Kristen Cooper was sort of sitting quietly in the bushes in Central Park because he was a bird watcher. And when he asked a white woman who had her dog off leash to put her dog on leash, she went into this racial tirade. And she said that she was going to call the police and say that a Black man was threatening her life. When you have someone who can so quickly conjure up an image of threat and then use that towards the police department, knowing that it would be credible, we have a broader systemic problem in our society that is much, much deeper than what the police are and are not doing. We also are in this incredible moment of transformation. Industries are taking a stand like never before. There are many, many problems with the tech industry. However, when you look at Twitter as a company, one of the things that they're doing is they are taking the hashtag statements that are anti-racist, they are putting them on billboards all over the country and now all over the world. And so here you see CEOs are putting money and resources behind anti-racism in a way that hasn't been done before. This makes me cautiously optimistic, but what I'd like to see more of is a deeper discussion of what institutional racism looks like in our day-to-day work, what's the psychological cost, and what we can do. So that's where I'm going. So I want to sort of pose the question of what might institutional racism look like, and I think this is a sort of nice a compliment to the panel that you had yesterday. So I'm sure you've had many discussions of what it looks like, and there is a very, very long history of racism and discriminatory practices in the insurance industry. I'm sure this is something that all of you know. But what I'd like to sort of think about is, what does it look like today in terms of day-to-day practices that keep folks of color from sort of really thriving in our careers? I wish that this was my own figure, but it came from Slow Factory Foundation and is a figure that sort of outlines the 4 dimensions of racism. And my point is that most people do not understand that racism and bias are systems. Well-meaning people can make harmless decisions that can lead to bias, that can amplify racism, oftentimes without even knowing it. Most people think of racism in the bottom left corner, that racism is interpersonal, that there are racist acts and microaggressions that are carried out from one person to another. And these are sort of moment-to-moment kinds of incidences. But what we know is that racism can also be institutional. Policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workspace or an organization. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. We also know that racism can function across multiple institutions. They can be structural, that multiple institutions collectively can uphold racist policies. And so we need to be working both at the interpersonal level, reading, raising awareness, but we also need to work at the harder institutional and structural level in this moment if we're going to see change. The consequences of this is that it can lead to, here it's called sort of internalized racism. I'm not really a big fan of that term. The way I like to think of it is that we have to contend with racism, and it has a psychological cost, literally a kind of racial exhaustion that I'll talk about in a minute. So let's just give a couple of examples of what institutional or structural racism might look like. This is a figure from 2001 from the original book by David Thomas. David Thomas is now the president of Morehouse College. But at the time, he was a psychology professor at Harvard Business School and one of the first scholars to try to understand the experiences of Black executives as they move up the ladder through their career. And he was interested in what is it that makes them succeed relative to Black managers, to white managers, and to white executives. And he found three critical things. Number one, the Black executives who made it all the way to the top, as opposed to Black managers, literally had zero failure experiences, meaning that when you look at sort of the world of corporate America, and even now, there's just an article in Harvard Business School just about a couple of weeks ago talking about the importance of failure experiences and having a failure resume. And this is the only way that you learn. But if you belong to a group where you're seen as the risky or the sort of chancy choice, your mistakes translate into you can't move to the next level. So the first thing that he found is that white executives had made lots of mistakes and they were seen as learning experiences. Black executives never became executives. If they made mistakes, they stayed in middle management. The second thing that he found is that Black executives wound up having sort of a really sort of career that had this sort of ebb and flow to it at the middle management stage. Why? Because time and time again, they were given more and more responsibility, but that responsibility was not linked to promotions and titles. So they were saying, here, do this. This is good for you. This is a stretch assignment for you. You're not ready to be an executive yet. So they wind up having this extraordinarily long period in the level of middle management, almost 3 to 5, sometimes 7 years longer than their white counterparts. Again, if the stereotype about a group is that you are just a little bit too much of a risk to push to the next level, the consequence of that is that you wind up staying in middle management for an extraordinarily long time. I see this across multiple industries. It's the best example of structural racism. I actually have seen it so often, I now call it the overpaid under promotion effect, because what happens is people say, we value diversity. We think that you're really important. You get a big raise, but you don't get the promotion. So you wind up being sort of off cycle relative to your contemporaries. And long term, it's actually damaging to your career because it's hard to move to a different company. The third thing that he found is that the cost of things like mergers and acquisitions, of not having a sponsor who's looking over your career for the long haul, has a disproportionately negative effect on Black middle managers. Because every time there's a merger, there's an acquisition, you get a new boss, you get someone who's looking over you that's new, you again are seen as being in a position of having to prove your worth over and over and over again. It's sort of like climbing up a ladder and then sliding down. So not having someone who's sort of helping look over your career over the long haul leaves you in middle management. Now, one way to think about it is that middle management is pretty awesome. You sort of made it far. But I would argue that I have seen this so reliably across the fashion industry, the actuary industry, the engineering, tech industry. This is a very reliable form of structural racism. What else might structural racism look like? I try to give presentations that focus on science and that are not particularly left-leaning or right-leaning. But I saw this commercial a couple of nights ago, and I absolutely had to include this in the presentation. Why? Because we've seen this before. This is a commercial endorsed by President Trump related to defunding the police. There's an older woman who's at home in her house. She's frightened. She hears a burglar. She picks up the phone. She tries to call the police, and no one is there. And then it says, you know, this is what you get in Joe Biden's America. Now, I'm not here to share with you what my political convictions are or what yours should be. And as I said, my husband is a federal judge, and we think about the importance of sort of respecting democracy and political views of all kinds. However, this is a very reliable racial playbook that is designed to stoke fear. There is many papers on this, both in the 1970s and 80s around the Willie Horton commercial. And number two, Hillary Clinton had a very similar commercial that she was using during the Democratic primaries against Barack Obama in 2007 and 2008. We know what this is. We know what the consequence of this is in terms of stoking racial fear. It's institutional and it's reliable in terms of linking these ideas to stereotypes about Blacks as threatening. Now, inside our industry, inside the company, what's another example of institutional racism? This is one of my, I think, favorite studies because of how powerful it is. And this is a study that demonstrates institutional racism. And it was a study around law firms. The story of this study is as follows. Several years ago, very powerful lawyers at law firms across New York City got together and said, we have a problem. And the problem that they said they had is that Black lawyers couldn't write. They said that when they look at their legal memos and their legal briefs, their writing quality is lower than their white counterparts. Now, they didn't quite say it that way, but that's essentially what they said. And they said we recruit from Harvard, and we could recruit from Yale, and we recruit from Northwestern and all these fancy schools. So we must have some kind of writing workshop or something to fix them up. I wish I had done this study, but I hadn't. It's conducted by Dr. Erin Reeves. And what she said is, well, maybe there's some type of bias in how you're evaluating these really difficult to read legal memos. So she conducted an experiment with actual partners in law firms, over 110 of them across New York City in the top 10 law firms. During these legal memo reading briefs and promotion times, what happens is the partners of the law firms, they read lots and lots of legal memos, and they give them a score from 1, which is terrible, to 5, which is great. What she did is, while this was happening, she randomly assigned these partners to read a fictitious memo, and they didn't know it was a fictitious memo because she made it look exactly like all of the other memos. It was several pages and had lots and lots of content in it. But she did something that was quite clever. She inserted spelling errors, sort of technical errors, and sort of factual errors, and she baked in about 23 of them. And the question of interest, and then what she did is that she randomly assigned her fictitious memos to either be purportedly written by a white lawyer or a Black lawyer. The lawyers always, their name was Thomas Meyer. They always had 3 years in the law firm. And the question of interest is, did the supposed race of the lawyer who was writing the legal memo, did that have an impact on how many errors that the partners found? And lo and behold, it had a dramatic impact. There were 3 points that I think are really important about this study. Number one, what they found is that when the partners read the memo that was written by the Black lawyer, they got a rating that was significantly lower than that of the supposed white lawyer. And remember, again, it's the identical memo. They just changed the race of the writer to be white or Black. The Black Thomas Myers memo was rated at 3.2. The white Thomas Myers rating was 4.1. So the partners were like, see, we're right. These, the Black lawyers are just not as strong of writers. But here's what happened next. What she found is that when the legal memo was supposedly written by the Black Thomas Meyer, the partners found significantly more spelling errors, significantly more technical errors, and significantly more factual errors than when it was written by their white counterpart. And in fact, when it was the white counterpart, they kind of gave them a bit of a pass. They actually spent less time reviewing the memo. Why is this structural? Why is this institutional? One, because they actually believed that there was a different problem, that it was about the quality of writing. And in fact, what was happening is that there was this reliable racial bias such that the partners were spending more time critically looking at the work of the Black lawyer. And the consequence of this is quite dramatic because it's not a problem in the system, right? If you find more errors, you should get a lower score. The problem is in whose group are you giving a pass and whose group are you critically looking at their work. You see the same phenomenon in the mortgage lending industry when you're scrutinizing people to be pre-qualified for loans. But here's an example in terms of affecting our work. Lo and behold, it's no surprise, one of the biggest stereotypes across multiple industries is that Blacks are seen as not particularly strong in terms of writing documents. So I started this with a reflection on George Floyd and Christian Cooper, but I would argue that this next study is another form of racism that sort of leaks into our companies. And this is just related to just raising awareness about the constraints that are put on individuals who are successful. This is a study that has been coined the teddy bear effect. And what a really well-known professor did is he took the photographs of Black and white male CEOs and those who were in the run-up to become CEOs but didn't become CEOs. He took photographs of them and had people rate the roundness of their face, the kindness of their face, how baby-faced they were, and how much they looked like a teddy bear. And what he found were two things. One is that the roundness, chubbiness of an individual's face predicted whether or not they were likely to become CEO or not. This is among Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies. The second thing that he found is in a regression analysis, the more baby-faced or teddy bear-ish their faces looked, the higher their salary. I would argue that what this does is that it places constraints on what you need to look like and how friendly you need to appear, particularly if you are a Black male, that there are constraints on how threatening and psychologically safe you make others feel. And that to me sounds very similar to the Christian Cooper, George Floyd tragedy that I sort of talked about earlier. What else does institutional racism look like? One of the things that I do in my sort of spare time is I help companies think about what does implicit bias training look like. And I am fascinated about how you can have a colorblind or a kind of training that really doesn't get at the core of what needs to be talked about. And here's one example. One of the things that we know as scientists is that the zero-sum game bias is one of the most powerful racial biases out there. This is the idea that when folks of color are promoted, when they are promoted in terms of leadership, some white leaders say more for this group means less for my group. So that's the idea that leadership is a fixed sum pie, and if you quote unquote, let another group in, then there's less for your group. That zero-sum bias mentality predicts lack of support for all kinds of diversity and inclusion policies. I have never been part of a diversity training that actually talks about that kind of bias, even though it's one of the most powerful ones, because it makes people feel uncomfortable. And a lot of times people's feathers don't want to be ruffled. Real institutional racism and anti-racism needs to get at those kinds of biases more so than just more generic decision-making biases. And finally, when you look at the data about what is it that are the biggest predictors of the vision of a CEO or of individuals in the C-suite, what you find is that those individuals that have a diversity of friendships in their private life tends to predict their endorsement of more inclusion policies. And in fact, it's some of the findings are really even more powerful than that. When you look at individuals that are on the Supreme Court, in particular men, over the past 60 years, the strongest predictor of whether or not they're supportive of policies and laws that are related to women's rights is not where they went to school or how much they know, but whether or not they have children that are girls. What is my point? It's not to go around, just finding more random diverse friends or having girls as your daughters, but it's the idea that the environment that you surround yourself with in your private life has a dramatic impact on your vision in your public life. So we need to make sure we're holding our leaders accountable in very different ways because their vision is ours. So I want to sort of make two other points. Like, what is the psychological cost of all of these different forms of institutional racism? They are really powerful and they affect all kinds of career outcomes. But what I also want to suggest is that it has a psychological toll. And that is one of the things, that is one of the worlds that I live in, is trying to understand the psychological cost. What companies are thinking about right now is, how do we create a sense of belonging? We need to have more belonging in this virtual space. And they usually do things like say we should have like Zoom bingo and Zoom virtual coffees and things of this nature. That is important, but it is completely distinct from the psychological costs of racism. What the psychological cost of racism, of implicit bias, what that does is that it calls into question our sense of belonging based on our identity. And that is distinct from generic forms of belonging. Identity-based belonging is the trust and comfort that one has in the certainty that one is accepted given one's race, ethnicity, culture, gender, sexual identity, and religion. And what we know about identity-based belonging is that Zoom coffees and Zoom bingos, if you already feel like you belong, it makes you feel closer together. But if your identity-based belonging is something that is not in line, or you don't feel a strong sense of identity-based belonging, all those other types of activities just make you feel worse. But even more so, what we know is that members of historically marginalized groups may question whether they belong or fit in in environments where there's stereotypes and bias towards their group, which I would argue is literally in almost every company, not just in the United States, but sort of globally. And that it's important that these concerns about belonging stem from the context, stem from all the different phenomenon that I talked about earlier. So if you are feeling like you don't belong, or you're wondering whether you belong, you're wondering whether this place is for you, chances are there's something amiss with the context. It's not just that you don't fit in. Why is this important? Concerns about belonging based on your identity, they can undermine persistence, where when you're working on a really difficult work project, you literally just have less cognitive mojo to finish it. It undermines motivation, where you're just less motivated to do those extra role, like go the extra mile for the company. And it undermines performance. It literally sucks up your cognitive brain power. So you just don't have the energy to work on the things that you need to do, which is precisely what we need more of in this moment. And what I want to suggest is that all of the sort of political, social sort of zeitgeist around race and racism in this moment can destabilize our sense of belonging. And what real anti-racism needs to do in organizations is focus on that. It's not about reading books and just raising awareness. We really need to make sure that this identity-based belonging is shored up. And what I also just want to suggest to you, it's not just the negative events that happen in society. It's just the constant discussion about identity. I think this is a tremendous triumph at the level of the Supreme Court just last month. When you look at employment discrimination, for the first time, the Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional to discriminate against those who have the same sex identity and gender. This is a transformative in terms of the rights of the LGBTQ plus population. However, even though it's positive, it still like triggers all of these ideas about which identities are relevant in the workplace and which policies are going to be changed or not changed. And so our society sends signals about identity-based belonging, and it impacts our work even when they're positive. I oftentimes, when I give presentations, I don't talk about Michelle Obama. She's sort of like a lightning rod. Many of us love her, others of her do not. But what I think is fascinating as a scientist is, why did people not like her? It wasn't just that she just happens to be a Black woman in the White House. It was that she never let society forget that it was a Black family in the White House, that Obama could be susceptible to the same societal ills as any other Black individual. She was constantly talking about or raising concerns about the identity-based belonging of her family vis-a-vis the White House. And at the time, people really didn't want to hear it. And now it just seems almost axiomatic that they would have those types of challenges as the first Black family as part of the presidency. So I want to end with just a few thoughts. Like, what are things that we can do? How do we get serious about shoring up this identity-based belonging? I think there's a couple of things. One is we need to start rethinking and understanding the problem. Every CEO that I've talked to, whenever that they say we really need to be anti-racism, they go to their same go-to people, their executive team, and they say, go do something. And then the executive team sort of follows their same script. But what I also know is every company that I've been to has the one or two people that have been kind of marginalized for years. They're mentoring people that other people don't believe in. It's not the people in the normal chain of commands that are sort of the normal rising stars. We need to get out from under our C-suites and start looking at people that have been engaging in anti-racist behaviors all along, because the answers oftentimes are already in your companies. What are they doing? How are they sort of behaving and acting in ways? And that level of specificity about who are the actual change agents and what are they actually doing are going to get us much farther than big flowery statements or our same go-to people. Actually, an individual in insurance actually shared that insight with me. The second thing is, I think I have never seen such freneticism around diversity and anti-racism. And I would suggest that there is no other policy in a company that has so much of like, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. The science of diversity and inclusion is clear. You need a 5 to 10 year strategy that includes these 5 components: a strong and compelling vision that has been vetted, that the leaders believe in, that you have an inclusion policy that's driven with numbers and percentages and goals of who you want in your leadership position, that you have leadership accountability, that managers, their promotion and their level of success is tied to inclusion metrics, that there are clear and compelling partnering strategies, both internal and then external client facing. And finally, is that there is an integration of diversity and inclusion, or diversity and equity inclusion, into the business strategy. It's not extra, it's not just part of human resources, it's embedded into the strategy. We know this, there's tons of research on this. This is what moving towards real anti-racism looks like. We can't just keep reading books. We have to make sure the D&I strategy that we have these 5 principles over the course of the long term. It's strategy, not the frenetic pace that we have right now. What we also know is that there is sort of easy inclusion and there's hard inclusion. And the easy inclusion focuses on access, and it focuses on access when individuals are at the recruitment level, whether they're just coming out of college or they're just coming into the company. That is an easier kind of inclusion, and a lot of people's anti-racist strategies focus on that. Why? Because you could start anew, you could start afresh, you can sort of bring in new people. Real anti-racism is about focusing on leadership, middle management, and moving people to the higher ranks of the company that have Black and brown faces. Why is that? Because when you focus on leadership, that is much harder. It requires thinking carefully about policies and practices that may be putting constraints on people's careers. It requires focusing on policies and practices that are not working. People don't want to do that. They want to do new. They don't want to sort of fix what's already amiss. But what we know is that the biggest payoff is when you focus on leadership and you focus on the individuals that are already in the organization, in your companies. Fourth, I think we need to get serious about structural inclusion. So this is a picture of Tom Ford, and he has sort of a fancy line of clothes that I can't afford, a Tom Ford line in the fashion industry. And some people think he's great, some people think he's not great, but what he did about 40 days ago is quite remarkable. He has a consortium of multiple fashion houses, the fashion industries across the Americas and Europe. And what he committed to as part of his anti-racist strategy is bringing all of these fashion houses together, creating a pool of what are called Black creatives who are individuals who are the major part of designing the clothes. And he's putting this pool together. So anytime a new fashion house is looking for a creative, which is the top leadership position, there's already a pool, they have sponsors, and they're sort of ready to go. So it completely upends this idea that we can't find Black. Because this is across multiple fashion houses and his name is on it, this is an anti-racism commitment that is structural. It's not just what he's going to do, it's him using his influence to bring all these fashion houses together. Whether or not it's going to work or not, whether or not he's serious or not, that remains to be seen. But it's this kind of commitment that is sort of what I would argue is really trying to combat structural inclusion. I just have two more and then I will stop. We need to talk about race and identity with purpose. I think it was incredible that last night you were talking about your experiences within the company, within your companies, and this is the kind of thing that needs to continue to happen, but it needs to happen within your companies, not sort of just here outside as we come together in this supportive environment. Yet another thing that I see, particularly in this past summer, is that part of the freneticism around anti-racism is people saying, we're gonna go to our employees and we wanna talk about race. And what does talk about race mean? People wanna learn about Juneteenth. People wanna learn about the history of slavery. All of those things are important, but racism is about the experiences that people have day to day that is slowing down or truncating their careers. And again, those are the things that people don't want to talk about. It's our responsibility to talk about them. It's the company's responsibility to focus on those because that's where change is going to happen. It's great to understand what Juneteenth is. That's not going to be linked to leadership and change. And finally, I don't even really have an answer to this, but we need to start thinking seriously about combating racial and ethnic burnout. The frenetic pace in which all of these anti-racism initiatives are working, all of us are often called upon. Some of this is not even your areas of expertise. You're called upon to do more and you want to sort of step up. But we know, particularly during this pandemic and working from home and all of the other challenges that we have, that we cannot continue to work at this pace. When you have racial and ethnic burnout, particularly on our parts, it undermines our health, it erodes our immune system, which will also lead us to be more susceptible to diseases such as COVID-19. But also it causes another kind of disease, which is the idea that, oh, anti-racism, it doesn't really work. Inclusion doesn't really work. It doesn't work when you're working at a frenetic pace that doesn't have a strategy behind it that is a 3, 5, 10-year strategy. In this moment, I have gotten, and I'm sure all of you have too, phone calls, emails, text messages asking, are you okay? And that is wonderful. I've never had those before. Some days I am okay, some days I'm not. But what I worry about is if we, particularly folks of color, are seen as being the victim or the recipient of racism, an irony will start to happen, particularly in a couple months. When the real work of bringing our companies back starts, people will say, don't focus on them. They're hurting. This racism is in the world. We need to transform that "are you okay" to who is part of your vision in terms of the leadership or for the company, and who are you creating space for? That's what are you okay really needs to mean, not just are you interpersonally okay today. I want to end by saying real inclusion is not easy. I know it is ironic to end with a story about a white woman, but I think Mary Robinson is incredible. She was the first female president in Ireland. And what's fascinating about the presidency in Ireland is that you have no sort of real power. So you have to lead by building coalitions. You have to lead by sort of role modeling, sort of positive leadership behaviors. And one of the things that she is well known for is her going into territorial, very antagonistic, dangerous zones in Ireland and having conversations with the IRA, which at the time were completely frowned upon and shunned by not only just Ireland, but the rest of Great Britain. Those were really difficult to do. They were unpopular decisions. She argues that that led her to become the most popular president throughout the history of Ireland. It's oftentimes the difficult things and the uncomfortable things that lead to real transformation. We know that racism is not new, but perhaps global outrage is. This is a figure from June 7th, and the yellow circles are the dots where George Floyd demonstrations or related civil unrest demonstrations have happened throughout the globe. We have not seen this kind of activity, animation, perhaps since apartheid in South Africa. This kind of global outrage that is continuing today at this very moment leads me to be hopeful that this is just not another moment that'll sort of fade into history. I want to end by sharing this photograph with you. One of the things I like to do in my spare time is cycle and race bikes. A couple weeks ago, I was up in the Catskills, a very, very remote farmland area in upstate New York. And I saw this sign outside a person's home. It says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And house after house after house had signs saying, "Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter." And this is the same area where literally a couple months ago, the last Ku Klux Klan biker bar closed down. It's these moments in the middle of these remote places when you see signs like this that make me hopeful that we are in a different moment. And I hope you are too. So with that, I will say thank you. I will stop the share screen and we're happy to take questions at this time. So thank you.
Valerie, thank you so much for sharing such a wealth of information with us. I feel like we're all sort of equipped now with additional information and research that we can take back to our companies, take to our friends, our families, and really continue this dialogue. I think a lot of people oftentimes need kind of that data-driven approach to let the problem be real to them. And I think you've absolutely provided us with that, for sure.
Thank you.
We have quite a few questions coming in through the chat, so I will focus on those. So it's more of you and less of me talking.
Okay.
I'll start with the first theme of questions that kind of go back to some of the studies that you discussed. And I'll start specifically with that teddy bear effect that you mentioned. I think all of us have kind of seen that person that has that likability factor and that charisma. And they sometimes go pretty far in their career, even if they don't have the experience or the expertise to back it up. One of the questions that came in was wanting to get your perspective on if you believe this teddy bear effect, one, also affects women, but also affects level of promotion and pay. One individual was saying that they feel like that might be the case, but wanted to kind of get your experience and your thoughts around if that's the case.
So when you look at the data for that particular study, the teddy bear effect did not apply to women, and it did not apply to Black women. And I think partly it's in part just because of sample size, because they were looking at CEOs. So you have to have some, there's like, Ursula Burns, right? Like that's it. You have to have a sample size in order to have a study. I think the likability, fun, not aggressive, that is one of the strongest stereotypes that haunts us as Black women throughout our careers. And there is research on that, but it's less about sort of this chubby faced sort of teddy bear look. That I think that's very specific for men. I think for Black women, it's more, are we seen as sort of approachable and not difficult? That's a different stereotype. So the answer to that question is, in terms of that paper, that particular effect was not found, but there's other studies that look at this whole stereotype of Black women of being difficult and not fun and ruining everybody's good time, and that so serious. And that's the stereotype that I think is more the one that sort of gets glommed onto us until the company's broken. Then they're like, please save us. So we need somebody serious. This is a big problem. And then with respect to the second question, it is absolutely the case that it's also linked to sort of promotion at the kind of lower levels. And the reason why this was done at the CEO level, Robert Livingston's author of the study, so I talked to him about it, is that it just shows sort of the kind of power of how what you look like sort of shapes where you can go. And, I know many Black men who make all kinds of decisions about whether they should wear an earring, do they show their tattoos, should they have like a little bit of fuzzy hair so they don't look as bald, and it doesn't mean that these individuals were not qualified, but there is this, the way I think about it is there's this added layer of, do you make me feel comfortable? And if you make me feel comfortable, then I will play with you. And to me, that's another form of racism. We have to, on top of everything else, make part of our job description is making other people feel comfortable. And that's going to be a really big problem right now, right? Because many of us are angry and stressed out. So you can't be angry and stressed out and then make people feel comfortable at the same time. So that's why I think that study is important, because of all the messages that it raises.
Yeah, and that definitely goes to some of my experience of being on panels of interviewing and recruiting. And there's always this idea, especially from some prior companies, specifically in tech, of, is this person the right culture fit? And sort of getting around that idea of, will they fit in? Is this someone that I want to hang out with? And those types of things.
Yes, I haven't done this research, but there's this idea of culture fit is, on the one hand, it makes sense, right? Companies do have cultures, they do have personalities, and you want people to fit in that. On the other hand, the reason why it's such a problem is that it has this incredible bias, which is that if I like you, you don't have to fit into the culture. Like, there's just something special about you and you're just going to make it here. If I'm not sure, then culture fit gets applied as a criteria. So it's only a problem when it's not applied equally. So that's the question. If every person has to fit this culture fit thing, then it's something real. When it's, I like you and there's just something special about you, and I'm not sure if you fit our culture, but wow, we need diversity, or we want someone who's out of the box, then that is a problem as opposed to something that's applied equally.
Makes complete sense. Okay, I'm going to try to go quicker because I think we want to kind of rapid fire these things because we have so many coming in. Another question along research-based studies. So a lot of the examples you shared are research-based or studies that have been conducted by scientists. And one of the questions that comes in is, do you think that's necessary, research in particular, to find relevant examples in like a specific company? Sometimes companies says, okay, we see these studies, but that doesn't really apply to our company. Do you think research is necessary for very specific particular companies to be able to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes and no. My experience in the tech industry, pharmaceutical industries, insurance, actuary, people who like numbers are compelled by data, number one. And number two, there are experiences that are specific so sometimes a phenomenon that's relevant to one industry may not be relevant to another. Having said that, there's also a phenomenon called motivated skepticism. And what that means is if you don't particularly like a finding or is not consistent with your worldview, you will figure out any way you can to like not believe the finding. I mean, we see this right now with the COVID-19. If it's inconsistent with your worldview, you can figure out all the problems with every study that's going to come out. That is a natural form of human bias. So what I always say is, as much as I'm a quantitative scientist, I actually think it's important to have compelling stories about people's experiences and some data. But if you notice, I didn't really show any figures. I used to show like lots and lots of data because I want you to know that I'm super smart and I'm a scientist. And that's like all just, it's just all noise. Because if you're not vibing with the mission of D&I, all of the data in the world, what it does is that people say, well, we just need more. And now your chief diversity officer or your ERG is spending years putting together reports to find more data. And then you're worn out. And so I think it's important, but I also think that part of the diversity dance playbook for people who are not supportive is to say, we want more data. So the answer to that question is sometimes it's useful, particularly if there's something new or, like one of the things I keep thinking about is racism worse or better in the virtual space? Like that's a question that I think is one would want to know. We don't know the answer to that question, but it's not always necessary.
That's a fair point. And to dig a bit deeper on that data piece that you mentioned, we're data people, like you said, and kind of thinking on that back end of a strategy has been implemented. We always think if we can't measure it, we can't monitor it. So from your perspective, what are some good metrics to think about as we think about our diversity and inclusion efforts to make sure that we're on track and progressing toward accomplishing those goals that we've set in our companies?
Yeah, I have the companies that I think are sort of most impressive are the ones that are really granular in terms of their diversity dashboards, that they're looking, they're sort of 3 or 4 things. I think one is looking at, your numbers, at every level and across different business units, across multiple identities. So Black men, Black women, white men, caring about intersectionality, LGBTQ plus populations, looking at age, look at as many different kinds of metrics as you can. I did this work with one company, and through their diversity dashboard, what they realized is that people that were working virtually, this was like 2 years ago, had a higher sense of belonging and greater connection to the company than people who came to the office. And that has nothing to do with race or ethnicity, but it really illuminated the work that needed to be done. I think that's number one. Number two is benchmarking vis-a-vis the rest of the industry. So it's not what are your numbers, it's what are your numbers relative to what's your top gun in that industry? Because if your company is new or just went through an M&A, or you want to know where you're at relative to your industry. I think that's sort of the sort of second piece. And then the third piece is time. Like, what does your data look like over time? Because people say our numbers are getting better. And like, you all understand regression analyses. After 10 years, things just change, right? Because of time. So is it time relative? Like, is your policy that started at this time lead to change at Y time, not just like change for change's sake? So, and your industry has like no excuse, because you all know about, when you're in the fashion industry, you're talking about numbers and they're like, I don't know about all this, but you all know better. Those I worked with this one company in the tech industry, and it was phenomenal. They benchmarked relative to the rest of the industry. Over time, they were able to link like specific policies to specific change or sort of lack thereof. And they had standard deviations and confidence intervals. And I was like, okay, this is really, I thought it was helpful, because what you got to see was what is working when you implement it when. And that's what I would want to know. Those are the kind of numbers I think are helpful.
Yeah, and I think kind of taking this a step forward. So say your company recognizes it's an issue, they've put a strategy in place, they've put these metrics in place to measure it. One of the questions that we have is, it's okay to miss your D&I target, but it's not okay to miss your profitability target, your growth target, your sales target.
Exactly.
Perspective on why that's the case, and what can we do to make this a high priority, like some of those more business-driven metrics?
Yeah, I think that the first question, I think you're sort of answering your own question, is diversity actually a business-driven metric, right? Because I see corporate strategies or lack thereof in the D&I space that you would never see in any other aspect of companies. I find it fascinating, number one. Number two, there's this whole rhetoric around like D&I is so hard. I mean, I was working with a company that was doing work on genomic matter, and I was like, that's hard. That's really hard. This is not as hard as genomic material. So anyway, so it's there's this whole if you don't want to do it's sort of hard. So I think that just number one, making that point. Number two, we're now in an era where we have to think seriously about what a chief diversity officer actually is and what are they supposed to be doing. There are so many people that have been pulled from other jobs that they're actually good at to become a chief diversity officer, which they're not trained in doing. And so part of the problem is you don't have the right experts in the right places. You have under-resourced D&I offices, and then people want you to sort of do more with less. And then you're sort of held accountable for this data and for people's emotional kind of craziness. So you put all that together, and it's really not surprising why many D&I shops are not as effective as they could be. And then also when these sort of D&I business units are not linked to the leadership, it gets really, you just have to have a CEO and a leadership team say, this matters, you have to make this happen. And without that, it's not that it can't happen, but you're swimming upstream.
That's a good point. You're right. A lot of these companies have taken the approach of putting a head of diversity in place and kind of going from that direction. And sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not. But really kind of thinking boots on the ground, day to day in the workplace, what I guess advice do you have for us, and particularly for our allies, of how can they be more inclusive of Black people and other people of color in their companies?
I think that there's sort of a couple things. What kind of worries me right now is sort of this idea of like anti-racism awakening, as if nothing has been done before. And I'm like, this is like kind of not new. Although I don't want to cheapen the murder of George Floyd and the magnitude, the impact that it has had on individuals. Having said that, one of the things that around these sort of really honest conversations around race in the workplace, and you'll see people have been having experiences that you can label as racist throughout their career. So I would say in terms of the advice, I think there's a couple things. I think one is just being more serious about the kinds of policies and practices that you already have. I was actually talking to an individual that was within the banking industry, and they are putting goals around leadership, that they want a certain percentage of African Americans in particular in leadership positions in a 5-year period. And it was a very aggressive number. And I was actually like, whoa, that okay, like wow, so you can't change what you can't measure. I think that's one thing that allies can do. I think the second thing that allies can do is so start really thinking really deeply about the practices that are already in place. So I'll give you an example. A common playbook that you see in companies is the development of ERGs. Tons and tons of work, lots and lots of work. The women ERGs, which are usually associated with white women by and large, almost always translate into leadership positions. So the person who's ahead of that ERG winds up being promoted, their career is amplified. You see the same thing for the millennial ERGs. When you look at the veteran ERGs, the Black ERGs, the Latinx ERGs, and sometimes the LGBTQ plus ERGs, it's the same amount of work, but it's just seen as like, oh, you're doing yeoman's work. Like, I don't even know what a yeoman is, but whatever it is, it doesn't translate into the kind of amplification in terms of promotion experiences. Why? Because I think implicitly the work is just not seen as valuable and as central. And that's like sort of one of many examples of an inequity in a diversity policy that's already in place, and a practice that's already in place. Who is the head of these ERGs? It's almost always a person of color who is spending all of their time at 2 a.m. emailing people like me. And I'm like, why are you awake emailing me at 2 a.m? This is crazy. But my point is that there's an inequity both in the distribution of the work, the impact of it, and it's part of that whole idea that our work is not always valued and seen as the leadership that it needs to be. So those are just two examples. I can think of lots of them, but of what real anti-racism looks like. It's not reading, I think the book Right Fragility is fantastic, but it's not about reading that book. It's about like looking at the policies that are already there and saying, this has to change.
That's a great point. I think we have an interesting next question that could potentially help solve what to do. There's a question that came up wondering if any of your research or things that papers or studies that you've come across, have any of them focused on work cultures that are not predominantly non-white, and if there are differences between the cultural norms in those types of environments versus what we typically see in corporate America?
That is a great question. And if you are out there and you ask that question and are interested in me coming in and studying your company, let me know. The answer to that question is by and large, no. There's a little bit of, there is research on HBCUs, historically Black colleges and institutions in the United States. But it's really at the college level, and it's looking at things like education outcomes and those sort of benefits of having Black faculty and so forth. To the best of my knowledge, there are very few, and it's mainly because you have to get in, you have to collect data. Non sort of white companies are just like every other companies. They have their risk and their general counsel, and they don't kind of want you in there fooling around. And so the insights are just not there. And so having said that, when you look at the college level data, what you find is that one of the fascinating things about human behavior is that we create hierarchies regardless of who is there. So if you have, pretty much an all Black organization, other kinds of hierarchies on whether you went to an Ivy League school or not, or whether you went to an HBCU or not, or whether or not you were born in the United States or not, that those types of divisions start to create other kinds of biases, but that still lead to imbalances in terms of promotion and so forth. So what specifically those are, it's not the case that sort of, Black owned businesses or minority owned companies are better. It's just that the divisions are different. What those are and how those impact people's careers, there just isn't research on that at least I can speak to, but I'd love to be a part of figuring that out.
That is completely fair.
Yeah.
Going along the lines of kind of that promotion piece, and one of the things you mentioned in your presentation is oftentimes Black workers can get stuck in this middle management area, and they're getting
Yeah.
the additional work, they're getting the additional kind of experience and stretch assignments, but not getting those promotions. What are some of the best practices for those individuals in those roles, so the Black workers who are in middle management and not progressing, that they can kind of, what types of things can they do to kind of get themselves out of that type of position,
Yeah.
type of
Well,
situation?
the first thing is, I mean, and probably one of the most gratifying, but yet saddening parts of my role when I sort of functioned at this role, when I'm sort of consulting and sharing insights with companies, is that I see the looks on people's faces when I talk about that. And I have never been in a room where, whether they're women, white women, members of LGBTQ plus groups, like people are like, because they're like, they know it's them. And the problem is you don't know it's you because it's a phenomenon that's across multiple industries. So I think, so I think issue number one, this is a place where awareness is absolutely key. That's number one. The second thing is benchmarking, really trying to understand whether or not, given your experience, your ratings in terms of your sort of promotion materials, like, are you actually where you should be at relative to someone else? The third thing, I also, I know I seem like really, really busy, but I also happen to teach negotiations at Columbia Business School. This is an absolute negotiation moment where you have to think of yourself in a broader role and justify going after it. And one of the things that is sort of really, rather than thinking about loyalty, which I think is wonderful and incredibly important, the more you're able to see your value across the industry in different positions, the stronger your stance is in terms of being promoted. And if you're like, I'm just going to stay here and keep my head down and then I will be valued, even the nicest companies, that's just not how business is done. So that benchmarking, by trying to understand your worth in other companies, trust me, it is so hard. One of the reasons why I feel like I'm never going to leave Columbia is because I don't have the psychic energy to go apply for another job. But at least I know better. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. But what that does is that it helps you to see who you are in that role, and that's really unfortunately about personal agency. And I think the last piece is, equitable sponsorship. Like, somebody has to be looking out for you. And it's not always going to be someone who looks like you. As a matter of fact, chances are it's not going to be someone who looks like you. And you have to find someone who believes in you. And, I have found many times, particularly sort of younger folks of color will come to me and they say, can you mentor me? And I'm like, yeah, because I like you, but they might be in philosophy or biology. Like, I don't really know anything. But when you find connections with people that are sort of genuine, that are not always just based on work, then all of a sudden they're gonna look out for you in a different way. And that requires building relationships, which oftentimes, particularly in this moment, you just don't feel like doing. But that key to getting a sponsor who's like, hey, why is Kendra where she is? Why isn't she in this project? Like, that's just kind of how it works, particularly, once again, in your industry. Like, you need someone to sort of look at you and say, I see something in you that's different. And that advocate for you is another critical piece to making that happen. But the first piece is like knowing that this is a reliable finding, and then B, wanting to do something about it. Because just because it doesn't mean you might be like, it's fine, I'm busy, or I have other goals, etc.
I think that's a great point. We always talk about mentorship and sponsorship and partnering with someone that has a seat at the table. And it's great that you highlighted that. And I think earlier when you were talking about your experience at Yale of someone else kind of taking that initiative and reaching out to you, I think that's a great example for our allies and for other people to understand ways that they can support us, for sure.
Yeah, and what was so great, I mean, it's hard to articulate that story, but part of the playbook is that we don't know what we're missing. So I thought I was doing the work of as a professor because I was doing lots of research. I didn't really have papers, but I didn't actually know that I should have like more. And what I was doing was okay. And I'm kind of friendly and people like me and I go to talks and I ask good questions. So I'm like, this is great. And, real anti-racism is like, yes, but that's not good enough. And what she said, it wasn't racial, but it did have she was like, you are on a trajectory where you're not going to do well. Like you're okay now, but you're not going to do well. And nobody says that to folks of color. Like, and I actually, my feelings were, I was feeling some kind of way. I was like, well, I think I'm pretty good. But then it was like, let me show you what needs to be done. Now, I had to be receptive, but I literally had never heard that kind of language about my career before. And so here she offered that to me, but we can also sort of reach out to do that as well.
Definitely. And I think it's great. I'm going to stay on this theme of kind of these difficult conversations. So that difficult conversation to kind of sell yourself, that difficult conversation of someone offering up kind of mentorship to you, and kind of segue into this question that gets at the thought of, a lot of these companies are starting to have these conversations around racism and these things. Do you have any advice on how do we navigate the challenge of making sure that these conversations continue, encouraging companies to keep them going and to progress on them, and making sure that these conversations don't get shut down after kind of the hype or the fad is over?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think that the answer to that lies in number one, having a clear purpose for what they are for. And what I saw happen was there's the George Floyd murder. Many companies were like, oh my gosh, racism is really horrible. We have to talk to people. That's not a strategy, right? That's not a strategy, that's a response. And that's fine because it's better than nothing. But if the strategy is to try to understand the spaces in which employees of color or whatever the identity is that's at issue is at sticking points, and what are the policies and practices that are getting at that would lead to a series of conversations that happen over the course of a year. And if the goal, and the other thing is a lot of these conversations happened without a goal. So what is the goal of these conversations? What are you going to do with the information? And if the outcome is about sort of personal healing, that's fine. But that's then if once you feel like people are already healed, then you're going to stop the conversations. If the goal is to try to come up with new policies, new practices, new ways of doing work, then you would have more that are shorter, that focus on different things. I have literally had people, executives come to me, and it's usually sort of like, I don't want to be seen as racist, but like, what conversation about race should we be talking about? And again, that's fine. That's fine. I've had people ask me what Juneteenth is, and I was like, I don't know either. I'm a scientist. I don't know. I'm sorry, because I'm stereotyping scientists. But my point is that that's not going to help people get promoted. That's just going to help your personal edification. But it's sort of like you have to have a goal, what's supposed to come out of these conversations, and people have to feel like when they're sharing them, it's painful to talk about the experiences that you've had. It's not fun. And so you have to feel like those experiences are going to translate into something new. And that means that you should talk about different, like one month could be on promotion. 1 month could be on recruiting. 1 month can be on ERGs. Like it should have a progression. It should have a goal. And then it should have an outcome that at the end of this process, something is going to change. And it cannot just be reactive. The world is horrible, racism is bad, and we want you to feel better. Like that's not going to, that was fine in June. That's not sustainable.
Completely fair. So we have only a few more minutes left. Want to make sure you're good with another question or two before I toss it.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. One of the things that came up is this idea of listening groups or listening sessions. And oftentimes that's kind of the approach that some companies take. Wanted to get your thoughts on it. Is that an effective way to kind of get feedback and develop strategies around diversity and inclusion? And with that, should they be led by kind of trained facilitators? And is there value in doing it that way?
Yeah, I have two different thoughts on that. I think so this is not science, this is just my own experience, just seeing what I think works. I think what works best is if you have some person who is a trained facilitator training and helping people that are in the company, that are the supervisors, the managers, and the leaders. Because when a trained facilitator comes in from the outside, they can sort of unearth all kinds of interesting insights, but then they can't really do anything about it. And also the practice of teaching someone that you work with on a day-to-day basis how to do this means that the behavior will be sustainable over time. So even though in the beginning they might be a little bit awkward and that's not so productive, they get better over time. But I also think that you can't just throw managers in who may have never thought about race ever, and now they're like, I have to do this. And it is hard. I mean, it is really hard to do. And so you need to have someone that you can go back to in an intimate space. So I think the structure of having like some kind of trained facilitator or expert who's helping executives, like sometimes what I'll do is I'll hold like just executive office hours for a company, and then they could just ask me any old crazy thing that they want. And I remember having a conversation with someone for 20 minutes about whether you should call Black people Black or African American. And I went there. I told there's studies on it. I talked about that not all people that are Black are African American. I did the whole thing. And they were super happy because it was helpful. But the point is they were terrified before, and they needed someone to just like help them understand this. So I think the answer, at least from my vantage point, is some kind of facilitator, expert, something or other, who people can go to like get feedback and training and so forth. And then the listening conversations will get better, and they do yield all kinds of insights, and not just about race. It could also be about other kinds of things. They're so incredibly important for this moment in time that we're in. So that in and of itself is a leadership skill. So that's another reason why to cultivate it within your team and managers and leaders.
That is awesome. So I'll close us out with one final question. And then of course, any additional or final thoughts you wanted to share. But for our allies who are on this call, what are some ways that they can push forward with inclusivity and ensuring that they have a diverse population in their respective companies? And then any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the group?
So that's a great question. There are so many kind of different things. I think when I look at probably the number one most effective sort of practice around anti-racism is this idea of sponsorship, this idea of you have leaders who may have really, they may think about race, they may not think about race, but if you sort of challenge them to say, are you going to push forward one individual who's not like them, who doesn't come from the same background, who's different in some way, and really sort of do that with fidelity? That is the most effective and fastest way, without adding on any new policies, to create change and to sort of build around that. I also think that we need kind of people still talk about a racial reckoning, but I almost think that leadership needs to sort of be in a room that's an intimate space with a closed door and really kind of rethink like what are we doing as a company, and be able to have that kind of back and forth, and allies that are sort of in this space can really push leaders to do that. Because the problem with this sort of anti-racism movement right now is that it has a knee-jerk, like, we have to do something. Our CEO wrote a letter, and now we have to say stuff that supports the letter. And this kind of work, in order for it to be sustainable, it has to be purpose driven, and it has to be linked to the mission of what your company does. And the actuary business, the insurance business, has a healthy history of racism. And everything from the body weight of people and insurance, to actuary tables, to mortality rates. And while much of that is being investigated, it gets baked into the culture. And so unless you sort of say, we're going to do business differently, it's those kinds of kind of baked in practices that don't change. So I think allyship is really both self-examination, but really pushing leaders to think about their mission in a completely different way. And this is a moment where you're sort of allowed that space in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think that that's what I would say. And I guess I would just sort of close by thanking all of you, and you, Kendra. Your questions and moderating are just so powerful. And this is an industry that to me is right up there with healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry. Like, we need all of you. You're like the lifeblood of the Black community. And I've really come to learn that. So I thank you all for what you do. And I'm happy to sort of follow up by email or LinkedIn with any other thoughts and questions. So thank you.
We appreciate it. We know, given the times and just the nature of the work you do, that you are extremely busy. So we definitely appreciate the time that you've shared with us today. There's been a lot of kind of kudos coming through our chat of people just absolutely enjoying this session and finding value in it. So we appreciate the time. And would love to, we didn't get through all of the questions, but would love to get any responses or perspective that you can share with us or the group.
Sure. Either reach out to me on LinkedIn, you can send them to my email, and I'm happy to. I'm so glad I even know. I had a LinkedIn account for years, and I was like, oh my gosh, people are sending me messages on this thing. That's so great.
Perfect. Well, you might be able to expect a few more after this session.
Okay.
For folks who are on, and maybe people who missed part of this session, this is recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, similar to the other sessions that have been held during our activities during the meeting. So I'd encourage you to go out, check it out, kind of listen in for a second time, share it with someone who you think it may be helpful for. And I also encourage you all to join us later today at 5 p.m. Eastern for our awards celebration. This is always one of the most exciting parts of our annual meeting. And we don't want it to go unheard of or unseen just because we are virtual this year. So join us at 5 p.m. Eastern for 30 minutes or so for our awards celebration, so that we can celebrate the folks who have passed exams and volunteered and all those great things. So with that, thanks again, Valerie. Thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day, and see you at 5 p.m. Eastern for the awards celebration. Bye everyone.